All right, here we are. This is me and Angelle, Melanie Perkins McLaughlin with Open Investigation Podcast, and Angelle Wood, Crime of the Truest Kind. Hi, Angelle.
Hi, look at us in all our glory. My hair and makeup was not available today,
My
so
hair and makeup was not available today either, and I am having a hard time. Anyone out there that knows I was having a hard time finding the filter on Riverside to get a little bit of makeup work here. So anyone that knows where the filter is on Riverside for your face, please send me an email. You won't have to deal with it so much next time. But anyway, Angelle, your setup looks so much more professional, I feel like, than mine. Have you been doing this for a little while? Were you on radio before?
yeah, and I spent a lot of time and something happened in 2020 that I spent a lot more time down here during that what 1 year that felt like 10.
Yeah, it did feel like 10. But yeah, so anyone folks who don't know, Angel was well, you tell them, Angel.
I worked in radio for a long time. I
Long.
worked in radio for more than 20 years as a radio DJ, and I worked at stations in the Boston area, WFNX, WBCN, WZLX, a couple other ones, but those are the ones that pretty much resonate with most locals.
All the cool ones.
The cool ones, the rock and roll ones
The cool people ones, yeah.
that had
Um,
hair and makeup. They didn't really.
um, yeah, and I'm a documentary filmmaker and have been for 20 plus years as well. So we come to the table with those prior life experience too. So it's good to be able to be here and talk about that. So let's talk about when we first met.
It's kind of an interesting story, I think, because looking back at those during that time when we met, you were very much focused on continuing Andy's story post Have You Seen Andy, your documentary that came out. And you had been focused on it, had been working on a couple of things. And then I started podcasting and I discovered Andy's story, which I was surprised when I discovered Andy's story because I had grown up in that area. We've talked about this a lot, but I had grown up in that, not in Lawrence, but sort of that the greater Merrimack Valley
Well,
area.
I think technically you're in the valley.
I guess so. Um, Groveland, Mass, which no one's ever heard of. You can look it up later, but it was pretty close to Lawrence and is very close to all of the other towns that are part of Andy's story. Certainly, you've listened to Open Investigation Season 1, and all of the towns that are mentioned there are really pretty much the area that I grew up in. So
Yeah.
when I first started to hear about Andy's story, I was like, how did I not know about Andy's story? I mean, he was older than me, but my siblings were around Andy's age. And I just couldn't believe hadn't heard Andy's story before then. And then, right away I discovered Melanie's documentary. I watched it and I really wanted to talk about the story. And I got to say, without Melanie's work, I don't know who would really know the story of Andy, like really know the story of Andy, because you tell the story of Andy.
You're right. I unmuted. I muted because I'm right in the air path, by the way, for Logan. So, and it always is right when I want to record that the airplanes start. I think they literally do the air traffic control knowing that I'm recording.
Here she goes. Everybody fly.
Exactly. Fly over Melanie's house now during recording. So I'm muting when the airplanes come flying by. So that was what just happened. But anyway, yeah, well, thank you. And it's not just a story, as folks who know that have listened to it and seen the film, listened to the podcast and seen the film. It's not just a story for me. It's lived experience. I was
Right,
with
right.
Andy that day. I was a 9-year-old girl and he was 10 the day he disappeared. And obviously this has been a trauma that's been with me and, with the community and most importantly, his family for all of these years. But yeah, so I decided after many years of working in documentary film that I needed to get his story out and to really validate the community of children that had experienced this loss because it changed all of our lives. It changed our parenting. It changed everything.
Yeah.
Um, and it still does. I mean, any of us talk about it today and you can see it in our eyes. But anyway, I had an editor that I worked with on some other projects. Mike Gill, who's a great guy, and has passed on, unfortunately. But Mike um, put us no put me in touch with another person that oops Mike put me I'm such a goof. Mike put me in touch with another person that we both knew. So anyway, mutual friend in Mike Gill. And so but you did the episode, I listened to the episode,
Mhm.
and that's when I was like, you were knew what you were doing. And most people that either listen to the story that I've already told or shared or the research, we'll just kind of co-opt the research and act like, they're telling the story. And, they might sort of in the beginning be like, oh, this is, saw this on HBO, and then sort of just take the material, which is unfortunate, but I think happens all too often.
Yep. It sure does. It sure does. And then you had said at that point, I was on the website, haveyouseenandy.com, and you said, we're working on a podcast. And I was like, oh, awesome. I can't wait for that podcast to come out. And I kept checking and it wasn't coming out. And then during that sort of around the same time, all of these, my curiosities were piqued about, the continuation of Andy's story. You heard my podcast, and then you reached out. We got in touch and we met. I remember we met for coffee, and I believe if it wasn't our initial conversation, our coffee meeting was on Andy's birthday.
It was our coffee meeting, and you pointed it out. It was really interesting when you said it because I was like, oh my God, I hadn't even really thought about that. And then finding out that we had a mutual friend in Mike Gill who, was in the music industry, and, you knew him and he knew you, whatever. It just really felt like it was kismet, and Mike and Andy and everything, we were meant to sort of connect. And when you talk about you were looking for the podcast and it wasn't out, I was producing it, had been recording for some time, had been like putting the story together, certainly had it in my mind, and knew which direction it was headed. But it was sort of the nuts and bolts of like really doing the podcast that were a little bit of a head game for me. Like even though I was reading, how to do a podcast, and it was stupid stuff. It was just like my RSS feed and things now in retrospect.
You were like RSS feed. I'm like, yeah, I mean, you can put that anywhere.
Yeah, not a big deal. And I was like, okay. And it's different. Like I'm definitely a visual learner an experiential learner. Like I want to learn from somebody teaching me one on one. I don't want to read a book. I don't want to, whatever.
Oh,
So
me
you were
too.
and you were so great about that. And you're like, we got this. Like you're going to make this podcast and we're going to get it done. I was like, really? Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. And we
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, we
And
did.
we did.
We just, you know what? We just found, you needed someone. There was one task that you needed someone for. I'm like, this guy. And and you had been working with somebody, you'd been working with Drew, who was
Drew
doing
Doherty was our composer. He
some
did some
music.
sound
Yeah.
design. Yep.
And it just was all this, and it's very much, you mentioned Mike Gill, you mentioned Drew. It's very much a part of the community that I've been in for the last number of years. I've been in the Boston, regional music community, and all of these people, there's all this crossover among that.
Yeah, there is. And you know what I love about these artists too is that they help each other out. Like no one's sort of in it for themselves and like, oh, it's not competitive. It's more like I'll help you, you help me. And I just love that. And that's the way it should be. And so really felt like a collaborative team. And and then we brought in Mike Joshua, and we had some other, folks that did research that were just amazing. And a number of people have worked on this project over the years because it took a number of years. And I also have a life and a paying job and other
Mhm.
things. So, I had to parse my time out to be able to do what needed to be done. And, we powered through, and it was such a big story to tell. Open investigation was such a big story to tell because it wasn't just Andy's disappearance. It was all the things that I found out after Andy's disappearance. And it was massive, and it continues to be massive. Like I'm still finding things out today. I just found something out last night that was huge. So it's like one of those stories where the more you research, the more you dig, the more you find. And I know that that's not going to stop ever. Like I could keep doing it and it would just keep being more and more and more and more. So that's been a really interesting piece because I was so naive when the documentary Have You Seen Andy came out back in 2007. I was so naive. I thought, like, if I could just get this story out, get this documentary finished, put it out into the world, I would be done and I could just, have kept my promise to Andy and, moved on with my life.
You thought you were just gonna button this right up and then move on to the next project. Surprise.
I totally did. And because that was definitely who I was in my 30s as well. It was like I was just going to get it done. Yeah, surprise is right. And I mean, I knew at the end of the film that I was getting into something that was more than Andy. It was really clear that there
Mhm,
was a bigger story here. And
mhm,
like I said in the podcast, I was pregnant, like literally, the film came out in June and my daughter was born in December. So, a few months later I had my daughter who had medical complexity and needed open heart surgery. And
mhm.
so I had all these plans where I was going to do education and outreach and marketing with the film. And that was all like, nope, that's not what you're doing right now. And, taking care of my daughter and being with my family was what I was doing. And
Mhm.
honestly, in retrospect, it's sort of like the universe knows what it's doing, right? Like it was time for me to take a break from that. Like I had just spent 5 or 6 years getting this documentary launched, filming it, rolling it uphill, pushing it uphill. And it was time to take a break. And as much as open heart surgery is not a break, it was
Different
time.
focus.
it was time to be with my family, and it was
Mhm.
really important time. And but several years later, as I said, something happened, and I was triggered to tell the rest of the story and needed it to get out. And you were so key in getting that out, and I'm just so grateful to you for holding my hand through that virgin process. I was a virgin podcaster.
Uh,
And you helped me through that. So thank you. You were
you're
gentle with me, Angel.
it's important, and you and I have spoken about this a number of times sort of off air, but I have found that this space, and I'll say this true crime space for lack of I don't know, a term that makes more sense, but this true crime space, there are a lot of women that are doing these things, and there are a lot of women that are really getting this kind of shit done. And it's been a really inspiring place to be because my background, yes, I've been in radio, but radio was very independent, which I have always been, and I actually still as this podcaster still reject some of those further partnerships that I need to decide if I'm going to make, like monetizing and all of those other things we don't
Right.
need to talk
Mhm.
about, but I still have this, maybe it's like this stubborn streak that I've always had, but being around other people, other like-minded people in this space, and being able to work with you and seeing the things that you have done prior to us, meeting up and sort of, we've had both Melanie and I, we have this very like-minded drive that has, it's taken on a new life for me, and I know that probably in many ways it has for you too, because I am now, I've learned in my time, this number of years that I've been in doing this true crime stuff and learning and meeting families, my whole energy is different and my whole focus has changed into advocating for these people in
Yeah.
every way.
Amen. Well, I have been an advocate, I feel like, since I was a child, right? So
Mhm,
I had
mhm.
to I had to um advocate for myself, in DCF, then it was called
Yeah.
DSS custody. I had to advocate for myself in college when I didn't have any adults any longer
Mhm.
to sort of guide me.
Yeah.
So I'd been doing that even from when I was younger. Frankly, I felt like I was always a bit of a self advocate. Other people call it bossy. But I was a girl boss at a very young age, and I have raised two girl bosses. So
Mhm.
I think it's a good thing. I'm happy to be in
Men
that.
are never called bossy, by the way.
I know men are never called bossy. Men are called leaders.
Yeah.
Men are called, executives. But
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, and I had been advocating for a long time, and then when I had Grace, my daughter, my third child that had the medical complexities, she really professionalized my advocacy because I
Mhm.
had to become a professional advocate. I took a
Mhm.
year long fellowship learning about, disability policy and leadership. I, got a graduate degree in education policy and, just did a lot of work, and became a certified advocate, educational advocate. So I had been doing it for a long time, but certainly always felt like it applied to this. You can call it true crime, call it documentary, whatever, podcasting space.
It's real life stuff.
It is. Bottom line is it's real stories, true stories
Mhm.
told with care and compassion, victim centered, trauma informed. And that's
Yep.
really what it's
Yep.
about.
Yep.
And so that was what we had in common. It was like when you were saying that, it's like, yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. And for me, it's also about policy change, right? I want these stories to affect policy to change systems. So that's where the legislative advocacy comes in for
Right.
me. And, again, that's why I got a master's in policy, and was a policy officer for some time in my professional field, just because it is policy that changes systems. So legislative policy, laws, you look at things like Amber Alert,
Yep.
Megan's Law, all of these things are
Yep.
things that changed, even the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was a law that was enacted. In the podcast, you hear that in 1977, people advocated for the first ever CSAM law, like anti-CSAM law, right? Like it's like, wait a minute, before 1977, that was not illegal, and it was like
Wasn't a
pretty
thing.
much no, like pretty much, yeah, which is just incredible. But I think we talk a lot as well, you and I, about the 70s because we're around the same age, and sort of just the feral nature of children in the
People can't believe it. When I make the joke about how, we literally ran the streets without shoes on. We rode our bikes barefoot. People, to some people that's impossible. Well,
gone
we
all
did
day
it.
long. Nobody knew where you were. It's like it was just, yeah, it's crazy that we could do that. It was like, you didn't have permission slip signed at school. It was just crazy.
Nobody was allergic to peanuts then either.
I know, isn't that I know. It was like everything has changed so much. And I remember my kids still laugh at me now. They're adults now, but they were like, I walked them to school in fifth grade.
Mhm.
And the school's at the end of my street. Like they were just like, yeah, you don't have to walk us anymore. But I just was not having it because having had that personal experience, of having a friend who was abducted. And, even I would see, and honestly, I think there was only one kid, and I can remember from when my children were young in our neighborhood who would ride his bike unattended. And I used to like be so judgmental of his parents. Like, what are they doing? And it's like, really? Like, when did that happen? Because our generation was gone. Um,
Absolutely.
you know,
I don't remember. I remember, at one point riding my bike from when my family moved from Groveland, Mass, and we moved to Southern New Hampshire, and I went to school. It was a private school. It wasn't fancy or expensive or any of those things. It was a church school, and there were probably like 30 of us. But I remember riding my bike like miles. It was miles away. And my parents thought nothing of me getting on my bike and running to school miles away.
yeah. And I got picked up by the Seabrook police once because my brothers and I were living in Salisbury and they wanted to go fishing and I wasn't walking, so I decided to take my bike and they walked. And they got down to the marsh in Seabrook and they wanted to go into the marsh and I was not going into the marsh, right? Like that was not I'm not going into the marsh. So they were like, "Okay, well then you can wait here." And I was like, "No, I can't. I'll ride my bike back." So I got lost. I didn't know the way back. And this was definitely a couple of miles as well. And so um I think I stopped at a gas station and the police picked me up. Thank God. It could have been anybody. Like, especially looking at this now, I was probably again around 10, 9, 10, maybe even a little bit younger.
Hmm.
And I got picked up by the police, and I'll never forget. Like, they got me like a soft serve ice cream, and I was sitting out on the like police like porch, for lack of a better word. I don't know what it was. Like, it was a front area outside, and I'm just like happily licking away at my chocolate ice cream when my mother pulls up. She was not happy. Get in the car. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and we think about all these kids, that were just literally snatched off the streets like that. And that's one of the things about this story is I just feel like in all of these stories is I really do feel like there, but for the grace of God, that could have been me. It
Mhm.
could have been my brother.
Mhm.
It could have been
Mhm.
any of us, really. And I think that it's so important that people understand that, especially when we're talking about CSA, child sex abuse. And
Yeah.
we know
It's
there's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 8, supposedly, according to the statistics, boys, although most of the statisticians say they think those numbers are higher because of underreporting.
Mhm.
One of the things I say is if 1 in 4 girls are experiencing CSA and 1 in 8 boys, then how many pedophiles does that make, right?
Mhm.
So it's sort of these things that I want to bring to the public's mind. And it was a tough listen. The podcast was a tough listen. But one of the things I wanted to, and the reason that it was a tough listen is because we do talk about this stuff. I try to be, you know, really thoughtful about trauma triggers and letting folks know so that we're not re traumatizing
Right.
people.
Right.
And at the same time, letting survivors share their truth because it's really important that they're able to tell their story in the way that they need to tell their story. And so being respectful of that too, sort of having those boundaries and that balance. But one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about today, and I'm looking it up on my phone right now because I'm like, what the hell? Because it just seems like it's happening. Like I can look back on, the Have You Seen Andy Facebook page or, any of the social media pages where I post a lot of this stuff. And it's like every day or at least once a week, there's a new story about a police officer involved in child prostitution or
I
not
just
child
read
prostitution.
I read another story today
I know
about
that's what I was about to read.
someone. Mhm.
The DA says Auburn police officer was one of 10 arrested in child predator sting. This was published today in today's newspaper. New details were released Tuesday about an Auburn, Massachusetts police officer arrested as part of a child predator sting. The Berkshire DA's office said Dominic Buschetto, 31 of Brookfield, is charged with sexual conduct for a fee and enticing a child under 16 for sex. This 9 others, ranging in age from 21 to 67, 9 other men, were also arrested in connection with the
Mhm.
operation. The DA's office said the sting was aimed at apprehending individuals engaged in criminal activities related to human trafficking. See, that's the thing too, is that back in the 70s, we didn't have a name for human trafficking. There was no
No.
such word.
No. It was often described as child prostitution, which is not a thing.
No, it's definitely not a thing. Children cannot prostitute themselves. The age of consent in Massachusetts is 16. Children under 16 cannot consent in child prostitution. And I would say even over 16. Selling your body
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
sex is not, something that children are aware of the ramifications and what that means. So yeah, child prostitution was what it was called back in the day. But same thing with, and we talk about this in the open investigation podcast, the same thing in the 70s. There was no word for pedophile.
Nope.
It was child molester, right? There was no
There was
such thing.
the creepy guy that everybody knew about, but they didn't have a real term for it.
No, and they didn't have a registry. There was nothing like that. So yeah, I'm looking through the my Facebook page because there's another one. So more recently, the town was it the town former town chief of Methuen.
Mhm.
Yeah, so former Methuen town manager. This was last week. So Methuen is in Massachusetts in the Merrimack Valley, not far from, actually adjacent to Lawrence adjacent. And former Methuen town manager Bob LeBlanc charged with child rape and indecent assault.
Ugh.
Former Methuen, Massachusetts town manager Robert LeBlanc, 80, an attorney in Methuen, will be arraigned at Salem Superior Court on the following charges: rape of a child, indecent assault and battery on a child under 14, 2 counts of indecent assault and battery on a person 14 or older, an attempt to commit a crime, indecent assault and battery on a person 14 or older. So this is the former assistant city manager of Cambridge, Massachusetts, former town manager of Salem, New Hampshire, as well as city auditor of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, member of the Democratic Party, and former town manager of Methuen, Massachusetts, and part of the laborers union. I mean, it just like,
I'm just looking at headlines. I just wrote, I just typed in arrest police sexual child sexual abuse Massachusetts. Auburn, Mass. 10 charged in Massachusetts in the Berkshires that you just read. Seabrook, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Former Winthrop, Massachusetts police lieutenant. And it just goes on. Judge sentences ex Brewster cop on possessing CSA materials. Brewster's on down the Cape. Bridgewater
Right.
police, so on and so on and so on.
Right. And on March 8th on Have You Seen Andy's Facebook page, Needham teacher accused of uploading child sex abuse videos.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Teachers, police officers, priests, parents. It's just such an epidemic that people don't talk about, that it's just incredible to me. And so when we say things like, you know, there's complicity, or there's organized trafficking of children, or organized, pedophilia, and people sort of balk, or like, or surprised by that or whatever. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, you think that these police officers don't know each other and don't know what their predilections are, and they don't know how to get, and it's gotten much, much worse with the internet, of course. Prior to the internet, it
Mm-hmm.
was it was in person.
Mm-hmm.
Even now, some of it is in person, because they want to verify with all the stings and stuff that exist
Mm-hmm.
today, they
Mm-hmm.
verification. But
We
also the
talked a
amount of.
lot about tech, we'll call it technology back in the day. CB radios were all the rage in the 70s and 80s when we were growing up. And that was, and we've spoken about this before, that it was like think of it as like the Twitter of the day.
For CSA.
Yes.
Yes, for child sex abuse, it was the way that pedophiles communicated with each other.
It was
And
their
also,
networking.
when you think about it, it wasn't just the Twitter, it was also sort of, the TikTok in some ways, because you can entice a child that way as well, right? So children were using them as well. It was on the TV. It was just sort of very much a pop culture phenomenon at that
Mm-hmm.
time. So people,
Mm-hmm.
and kids don't realize that, but it was definitely a way that folks communicated. So yeah, that was one of the things I wanted to talk about, is just the prolific nature, and how we see this on the daily, and how we, like, what can we do about it? It's not just seeing it, like, what do we do about it? And that's sort of one of the things I wanted to talk about. You want to talk a little bit, Angel, about what we've been trying to do about it, and both as podcast hosts, but also advocates in the area.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, first of all, I think talking about it on it, just like a lot of these situations that we're constantly talking about, like, let's put the blame where it belongs, and let's, these people who live in shame, let's allow them to, come into the light and have a little bit of freedom from this. When I say that, I mean these people who have been languishing for years and years and years. And just a sort of sidebar for a minute, the things that I have learned about, you know people who are now survivors of this kinds of abuse, they don't actually come to terms with this until far along into their adult life. And that's where the legislative advocacy comes into play. Uh, Most importantly is trying to get these folks that have gone through this kind of abuse, who have gone through, years and years of turmoil, inner turmoil, who have been dealing with, you know substance abuse, etc. um, allowing them to be able to talk about this, and we as advocates talking about this and telling people, we recognize and we believe what you're saying, and we know this is true because you've you've done the research on a lot of these cases. So, one of the things that I've always wanted to do since I've been learning about this, and by the way, I'm always learning. I'm always learning. I'm always talking to people about this. I'm always going to things where I can learn more about how to be better at this. And one of the things I always wanted to do is try to reach out to folks on this kind of level, as just like an everyday advocate. Nobody who I don't look at myself as somebody who's ever going to be like a professional in this field. I'm always going to be learning, but my goal is to always have not have the answer, but act in a compassionate way to be like, hey, we're here for you. And one of those things I hope that we can do is move forward on an advocacy coalition that I think is one of the most important things that we can do as advocates, meeting these people who don't have any resources, who don't have any information, who don't feel like they have any support.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we have been doing. So we created, an organization that we've branded, called MPAC, Mass Missing Murdered Persons Advocacy Coalition, where we're really looking to bring families and survivors and friends and community members together to
Mm-hmm.
heal and to talk about, their experience, and also to learn how to advocate for change and how to really create systemic change. So we'll talk more about that. You can certainly, reach out to us about that. And you can find us on, our podcast platforms, or our link tree, or whatever. They're all on our websites and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
People know how to find people today. So do reach out to us if you're interested in that. But also, one of the things that you said a minute ago, Angel, that resonated with me is like, certainly, yeah, sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? Getting these stories told, getting them out into the open. But also, I really loved, for folks who remember, not that long ago, the Giselle Pellico story,
Oh
right?
yeah. Oh yeah.
The woman, this horrible story, right, of this woman from France who was being drugged by her own husband,
Mm-hmm.
who was bringing in men
Yep.
to rape her, to assault her, while he, took pictures, videotaped any number of things. And she was having all of these physical symptoms that she didn't know what was going on. And this went on for years until finally he was caught, and she agreed to be identified, was public in being, in her testimony. And a lot of folks in France and around the world were like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you putting yourself out there like this? Which was incredibly brave of Giselle Pellico to do. And I loved what she said. She said, I'm not the person who should be ashamed. They are the people who should be ashamed.
That's right.
And even many of those men got away with it. Like some of
Mm-hmm.
them,
Mm-hmm.
didn't even get convicted of anything. But, a lot of them did. And more importantly, like, she was such a power of example. Especially, it was right around the time that the podcast was coming out, and I was so moved and impressed by what she was doing. And it's sort of, if I could only be, that brave a person as Giselle Pellico to advocate and to shine a light on this for people to help them heal.
And could you imagine for a moment that I'm sure they exist, people who are like, oh, that didn't happen. She just wants attention. That kind of stuff dumbfounds me. When somebody comes forward and says, this happened to me,
Yeah.
that is probably years of working through some of those things. And certainly I can't speak for her, but I can venture a guess that it was a lot of therapy perhaps that helped her get to that point. But when, you know, even people in my own friendships, in my own circles who have had, varying things happen to them, it's their story to tell, not mine. But when people will say, they're just making it up, that's outrageous to me, that someone would think someone's making that up. Why would someone put them out like that? Does it happen? Yes. In very small percentages do people make up things like that. But by and large, no one's putting themselves through that to make them up. Somebody on that scale, the number doesn't matter. It's several men over several years got
Yeah.
away with this until she finally spoke up. She finally came to the
Well,
realization
when she
what that
understood what
left
was
behind.
happening to her,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and it was when, the police had to convince her with the video and the pictures that they had, because she couldn't even believe that her husband was capable of that. And that's the other thing, is like people hiding in plain sight, right?
Oh,
Like you
yeah.
don't know these people, like the police officers we're talking about, or the
Mhm.
teachers, or the anything. I still, and I think this is part, frankly, of my interest in true crime. When people are like, oh, true crime, and I laugh at when I see those Instagram memes where you see like the husband, you know you know mowing the lawn outside, and he's got his AirPods in, and somehow they switch to his wife's Bluetooth when she's listening to true crime, and he's like, listening to these horrible stories and wondering what's going on. And but I think that's a big part of why I listen to true crime and why I watch true crime, is like I'm always trying to find that thing that I'll recognize in somebody as
Mhm.
to why they are the way they are and why they did what they did.
That's incredibly interesting to me because that's another great aspect of this that I didn't quite connect. I watch it. I do all of the things. I consume all of the things because I want to know what makes somebody like that. I don't want, I'm not there for the exploitative, the
Right.
gore of it,
Right.
but truly I want to know, like, what happened to
Yeah.
you?
The
Like,
abnormal psychology. Yes.
why are you doing this?
Right.
But that's it. That's a whole nother, you just brought up a whole nother component to it. It's like, can I notice something in this that may shine a light on why?
Right. Right. And a lot of times I can't, to be honest with you. I mean, there's sometimes obviously when there's obvious childhood trauma and other things like that that you can attribute. And certainly folks like, um, and who did the, oh my God, pornography and sex rings book, who was just on, they have a Hulu videotape. I mean, a Hulu documentary on her. Why am I blanking on her name right now?
Oh
And
my God.
you're
I,
blanking on it too.
I am now.
Well, I have the book right here. But it's yeah, she wrote this amazing book back in the 70s that really sort of detailed, you know, child pornography and sex rings. I mean, isn't that crazy that there's a book called Child Pornography and Sex Rings? But it's Ann Wolbert Burgess. And this book is really about child pornography and sex rings in
That's right.
Massachusetts in the 70s.
That's
This
right.
is not this is
People,
not
they don't want to believe it. They
this is
don't
not
want to
yeah.
believe it.
I mean, this is what I'm saying. This is not like a just, and it's all kinds of reference information as well. But she did these amazing studies, and there's a documentary featuring Ann Wilbert Burgess on Hulu right now. And she's an amazing woman. And I talked to her very, very early on in my work on Andy's story and Andy's film, because it was apparent to me very early that there was more going on. In fact, I say that the first time I talked to Andy's mother, she said, "This is a lot bigger than you realize." And
So
at the
she knew.
time, huh?
She knew. Andy's mother
She
knew.
did know. And and she says I can't count the number of times, even now she'll say, I told you so. You know what I mean? I'm like,
Oh,
I know, Faith. I really thought that
yeah.
maybe it was the musings of a mom who just felt like, her
Mhm,
child
mhm,
is the most
mhm.
important, which is how every mom feels. But no, she was right on and she knew, she told me from day one. But we were talking about that the other day. It's like, I had no idea what I was really in for. And she and I were talking, actually yesterday, and she said, Melanie, I don't really think there's anybody else that understands this as much as you do.
Mm.
Even my family, she said, because a lot of my family are sheltered from the story.
They don't want to accept it.
Exactly. I don't want to tell them, or expose them. It's like, and that's the other thing is
Mhm,
like, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
mm-mm,
Once you learn things, you can't unlearn them. And
mhm.
so I can understand that protecting the family members and stuff. And I appreciate that Faith has trusted me these 25 years, with her family and, her son. And it's been quite remarkable. But she did say yesterday that, she really feels like that. And it's true. I'm the archivist of this story. I have
Yeah.
hundreds, if not thousands, of files and certainly hundreds of hours of video and audio and all of it. It's just remarkable. But getting back to sort of in Burgess, and the reason that we were talking about her is sort of, yeah, she was this pioneer in bringing this information forward. And she, in the Hulu doc, it shows how she was really looking at abnormal psychology and really trying to profile the reasons people do the things they do. And she became, an adjunct, if you will, to the first behavioral science unit at the FBI in Quantico, Virginia. And that's a lot of what the documentary is about. It's a great documentary, and Anne's a real pioneer in the work. And, a big part of that is there are some things that are telltale signs, right? There are some
Mhm,
things like abusing animals,
mhm.
as children, or wetting the bed, right? Like wetting
Mhm.
the bed, for a substantial amount of time. Like Wayne Chapman, the main suspect in Andy's case, abused animals, was a bedwetter, like,
They like to light things on fire.
yeah, light things on fire, sort of all of these telltale signs about things that could happen, problems with their mother, relationships with the, sort of,
If you look at if you look at some of the, I know it sounds a little bit too celebratory, but if you look at some of the big name serial killers, right? The Bundys, the Raiders, etc., the Ridgeways, a lot of those men, and it's always men, it's very rarely women, a lot white men, as a matter of fact, a lot of those men stems from relationships with their own mother and the chaos and sometimes trauma around the relationships in their early, adolescence around their mother. For example, we're not here to talk about Ted Bundy, but his biological mother he thought was his sister. And there's a lot of things that stemmed from the relationship with who he thought was his parents, but were actually his grandparents. And
Yeah, and the effect of that.
that's a whole nother show, Melanie.
That is a whole other show. But the other thing is, like, when people say to me, like, when there's somebody who might come forward with information in this story of CSA, and they themselves are a sex offender. They're an adult now, they're a sex offender, and a lot of people, especially law enforcement, but certainly others, will say, like, they're not credible because they're a sex offender, or they're whatever because they're a criminal. And I say, exactly the opposite. Like, I think that they've been exposed to this environment and they know the environment, and they're the ones who actually have some inside information. And I get a lot of pushback too from survivors who were experienced CSA as children and didn't become pedophiles, right? They're like, well, I didn't become a pedophile. So, and I say, no, I understand. And I'm not excusing pedophilia for somebody that was a child abuse victim. What I'm saying is, somebody said to me once, and it was so helpful for me to hear that. It was that not every child who is abused becomes an abuser, but every abuser was a child who was abused.
Yes.
And I thought that was really powerful, because I was like, yes, exactly. And what makes the difference? I don't know. And that's one of the things that fascinates me. So going back to that abnormal psychology piece, like, what makes the difference? And somebody said to me once, like, what do I think made the difference in my life? Like, I had a really traumatic childhood. A lot of neglect and abuse. I am a CSA survivor myself. It was, I think, minor compared to other people. And, when I say minor, it's like, how do you qualify CSA, and, it was a babysitter. And part of it is like, maybe I don't even remember it all, and I think it's minor, or maybe I think it's minor because I'm trying to minimize it in my own way, but certainly had my own childhood trauma and have worked really hard on it. Have spent many, many years in therapy. That was something you said earlier about therapy. And I was like, I wanted to mention that because Billy Giblin says that in our episode on advocacy at the end of Open Investigation. And he talks about how important it is to have support when you're confronting these demons, right? When you're recognizing what happened to you as a child, when you're finally maybe stopped the substances and are starting to feel again, right? Or any of those things. It's like really having a good quality therapist. And again, I think the universe knows exactly what it's doing in terms of where I'm at in my life. I had a good solid 8 years of intense trauma therapy before I did the podcast. I should have had it when I was making the film, frankly. But instead I used substances, right? I drank alcohol and found other ways to sort of deal with those feelings. And today, thankfully, I don't have to do that. And that is also a blessing in a way that I was able to tell these stories, is that I was able to tell them sober and with real treatment, so that I could be trauma informed and understand, what I was saying, but also being thoughtful of other folks when I'm saying it. So I think that's really important. Therapy is really important for folks.
And I'm concerned that folks aren't able to access it. And that's another component of hopefully this advocacy that we can do is maybe help some of these folks get into a place where they can start to really come to terms with this and start to heal.
And one of the things that we hear from doctors who do this work, like Dr. Judy Herman, who wrote the book Truth and Repair on trauma, which is also featured in my podcast. She talks about how advocacy and really doing advocacy and telling your truth and being able to share your truth as a survivor helps heal survivors. And so not everybody's ready for it. Not everybody is, able. But for folks who are, they talk a lot about that feeling of validation in terms of being able to come to the State House, like Billy Giblin from the podcast, being able to go to the State House and, tell, the legislators there and the room full of people there what happened to him and who his abuser was. And, very validating for survivors to be able to do that. And even more so if there's a law that's created, right? And that
Hmm.
you can see systems change. I think it's really important. Another reason that I really felt like I had to tell the rest of the story and will continue to tell the rest of the story in Andy's case and the case of these other children is that I 100% believe there are hundreds of children in the Merrimack Valley who are victims of child trafficking from the 70s, and onward, maybe even earlier, that have not realized that they were part of something systemic, that feel like it's their fault or they were the only one, or
Hmm.
if they hadn't done this, or they didn't tell because, or all of these things. And I just, for me, somebody said, what would be justice for you, in these stories and telling these stories? What would justice look like for you? And I said, justice would look like a task force investigation, right? For
Hmm.
me, of the 27 unsolved and counting, 27 and counting unsolved missing and murdered children's cases, a task force investigating those cases. And also, justice for me would be, being able to help those survivors in the Merrimack Valley, those children who haven't been able to acknowledge or be part of something to help heal themselves from their own, trauma, and also to honor all of those who have gone before us, who died from it,
Hmm.
Bob Hotzen and others talk about, Bob Hotzen of Road to Recovery, and folks from SNAP talk about CSA is soul murder, right? It's like just it
Most
murders your
definitely.
soul. Yeah. And so these people that had, drank themselves to death, right? Or used drugs because they just couldn't cope with, the things. And so all of those, honoring all of those victims too, who have gone before and have not been
There are a
able to.
lot of people who are no longer alive
That's right.
because for all of these reasons they felt like they were responsible. They felt
Yeah.
like no one was going to listen to them. They felt like, who cares about it? Who cares about me anyway? And all so many other reasons.
Right. Right. Yeah. I was reading something last night. It was just, because again, doing the research, it was reading something last night about, people who took their own lives, because of this, and and some of whom, again from the Catholic Church, or even, there's a case in the Merrimack Valley where a young man took his life on the property of one of the churches, and he was a church
Mhm.
survivor, a clergy abuse survivor. So I think it's just so entrenched, and people don't realize how much so. So I'm hoping that we can really help folks that are out there. And if you're listening, there are places, to go. We talk a lot about RAINN, RAINN. We talk about in our in the podcast and the numbers. That's for survivors of CSA and any other SA. And I want to get the number for them before I go on. But yeah, so really making sure that folks have support and knowing that they're not alone. And I think one of the first things, RAINN, is the Rape Abuse Incest Network. And the number is 800-656-4673. Again, that's 800-656-4673. So if there are folks that are listening and really feel like they need help, there's a whole army of survivors out there, that are willing to help, and, help people move forward in whatever way that they can, So I think that's important for folks to know too. I also want to say there have been people who have reached out as a result of the podcast, even as
Mhm.
recently as this week when you said something about, it's usually men. I actually had a woman reach out to me this week and ask me about doing a show, or doing more than one show on, women on girl abuse.
Okay.
And that was her experience. And she
Mhm.
was saying how, again, that's even less talked about than any other kind of abuse. And I was like, that's absolutely true. And, in a lot of the cases of these children too, we see that it's their parents that are trafficking them. So that would be their mothers and their fathers, or whoever,
Mhm.
some for money, some for, sadism, some for any number of reasons. But yeah, that was really important to hear from her. And I thought, that is important, and something that we probably will follow up on too. And then just the people that have reached out. There's been a lot of incredible people that have reached out with amazing additional information, and we're going to follow up with you. There was somebody who reached out to me, by the way, on Buzzsprout. If you're out there and you're listening, we don't get your email on Buzzsprout. So we can see your email, but we can't reply to your email, which is just a weird. So Buzzsprout is our host, my host, and Angelle's Crime of the Truest Kind hosts on Buzzsprout as well. It's the platform that hosts us, and they offer a lot of great things. But this is not such a great thing where you can email the host. Excuse me, you can email the podcast through Buzzsprout, but we cannot see your email. So somebody emailed me on Buzzsprout and they said, I really would like to talk to you about a network of, pedophilia abuse that was happening in the Lowell area in the 70s. And if you're listening, or if you know somebody that's listening that knows about this, I would really like to talk to folks about that, because they were, again, looking at Ann Burgess's, child pornography and sex ring. She talks about South Shore, North Shore, different locations. And Andy was on the North Shore. I'm really, not that I'm not interested in general. In Massachusetts, I am, of course, for all of the children, but especially on the North Shore. So when folks, when that person shared that about Lowell, I was really disappointed that I couldn't reach out to them. So if you're listening, I'll put that on my social media as well. Please reach out to me at openinvestigationpod@gmail.com. You can email me there and I can get it and be able to respond to you. Yeah. And then there was somebody else that did reach out on the podcast this week that had some incredible information, that was part of the Revere situation. Right. And was that, involved in a way that maybe not particularly in that exact apartment or in that exact ring, but knows about it, had a parent or other that was trafficking them and was exposed to a lot of what was going on in the area. And I'm really eager to talk to them because, again, these are adults now in their late 50s, 60s. And like you said, a lot of them are just starting to talk about it, start to come to terms about it. And, you know, I think some people 19 in 2026, it'll be 50 years since Sandy disappeared.
Yeah.
And I think people are like, why are you doing this? It's been 50 years, and it's like anybody who's lived 50 years knows this, that it can seem like yesterday. It can seem like yesterday, and when it's something like that, it does seem like yesterday because trauma is imprinted on our mind. But also, I don't care if it was 50 years ago or 70 years ago. It's a child that needs to be found, that needs, that deserves the investigation, that deserves all of the resources that can be marshaled for that. And also time can reveal actually that I meditate every day in the app that I was using, Insight Timer. This morning, they do a quote every day, and the quote today was "Time will reveal." I loved it because it's true. It's like, as we get older, time will reveal, and I think that's why people are able to talk about it as they get older. What are your thoughts on that, about people that come to you as a result of hearing stuff on your show and are able to tell you more, give you more information?
I'm I'm pretty honored that somebody may have found something that resonated with them and they want to share their story or their part of the story. I welcome that a lot, and that's one of the things I enjoy when I do live shows. I'll be talking about a case, and some people are in the audience that might be from that town or that from that area, and they chime in with things that I would never be able to find researching in some research website. There's information that comes from people in person that you'll never get on, some paid research site.
That's true. There's nothing like the lived experience of people that have actually been through it. I couldn't agree more. And survivors and family members. And let's talk about the family members for a minute. I know we know a number of family members that have experienced the trauma of losing a loved one, either to murder or who are still missing. And, we've been around a number of those people and heard from them. And recently we're at a podcast together. You and I went to Advocacy Con together in Indianapolis, where we heard from families there. Beth Holloway was the keynote, and also Gabby Petito's family was there talking and sharing their experience. And, I think there's two kind of universal things we hear from families. One is that they're often frustrated with law enforcement, right? That's kind of universal. And
Very.
then the other is that they're incredibly frustrated with the exploitation of their loved one.
Oh, yeah, people take their story and make it their own, and this is something I was thinking about just this afternoon, that I'm not a big fan of, sanctimony and virtue signaling or any of those things, but I know a rat when I see one, and I know when someone's taking someone else's story and exploiting it for clicks and shares, and people monetize these stories. And look, I don't fault anybody in this community for sort of commercializing their work, but I do find fault if somebody wants to take someone's story, not credit people for their work, steal people's work right out from under them and not do the research on their own. We know some really big podcasts that I'm not going to name that actually have done that. It's like a level of plagiarism that we hadn't seen before. Um, it's icky to see that kind of thing. I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but
No, the other
yeah,
thing that I think is really, yeah, and like you said,
families have just been re-victimized over and over and over again.
yeah,
We've seen families who have been blamed for the disappearance and or death of their loved one by these content creators, air quotes. It's a mess, and it's shameful, quite frankly. But we've met families who have for years and years and years been on this journey to try to find information about their loved one, and only more recently have been able to get that support through these advocacy
yeah.
avenues that we've been talking
Right,
about.
and learn how to do the research and, maintain the research, and that's something absolutely we share with families and try to teach them, how to do and organize and what next steps could be in their advocacy efforts, and so, so important. But the other thing that I find extremely frustrating is, of course, there are other people out there who are interested in making money off of somebody else's pain, or, just stirring the pot and, becoming, a part of the story themselves, right? And making money for that, and and what have you. But the other thing that really just puts me over the edge is when people, quote unquote, report misinformation,
Oh
right?
yeah,
When they
like they're
perpetuate
breaking some news.
when they perpetuate misinformation, it just drives me crazy. It's like, and I've been accused of people being like, oh, I've been accused by some of these people of saying, oh, you think your theory about what happened to Andy is the only theory. And it's like, to be clear, I don't. And at the same time, what is my theory of what happened to Andy? Because
Mhm,
people don't often know it. People automatically might say, oh, you think it was Wayne Chapman that took Andy. No, I didn't say that.
mhm,
Wayne Chapman was involved in the disappearance of Andy Puglisi, 100%,
mhm.
in my opinion, and based on all of the witness testimony,
Based on your research.
based on my research, based on the things that he said and his audio tapes, based on, the fact that he took children there from the year before, based on,
Mhm.
his identification by a number of childhood friends of mine as well, based on, I can't even, it's countless. So I know he was involved. And I made it very clear in the podcast, and, not so much in the film because I wasn't ready to do that yet, but I made it very clear in the podcast that I don't think it was just Wayne Chapman.
Right.
I think Wayne Chapman was one of, and Wayne Chapman was arrested with a lot of high end camera equipment for a janitor in, from Miriam Hospital. He
Something
had,
was bankroll that.
oh, 100%. He had
Mhm,
thousands and thousands of dollars of high-end
mhm,
camera equipment. He had a dark room in his apartment. He was producing. He was 100% producing material, and he was traveling all around to produce that material.
mhm.
So, he was a wheel in the cog, if you will. And I think that that's part of the structure of these things. If you read some of the books on how these organized rings work and how things occur, they're just like and the army, just like in any sort of organization, a CEO, assistant CEO, any sort of structure, there's a top down, bottom up structure, of how these things are run. It's a business. It was already $1 billion industry. I'm talking about CSAM back in the 70s. And Chapman was a producer. He was a photographer, camera person, and also a pedophile. It probably was one of the perks of his job, frankly. And that's just as disgusting as you can think of, but it's true. It's like, but was he the only one? No. And that was one of the things that kept bothering me, was that, what was he coming to Lawrence for from Rhode Island more than once?
Mm-hmm.
Why was he there? What was happening in Lawrence that was bringing him there? And that was sort of part of what I was digging at when I was getting some of these answers. But back to the folks who put misinformation out there, so people will misreport things that they've, thought they found that are just not true. And when,
Mm-hmm.
you know, folks are like, well, who are you to say that it's not true? It's like, because there are facts, right? Like, if you have evidence, if you can show me the police report that says that, if you can show me the facts, and that's what we did in the podcast. We showed the facts, we brought receipts, but it's like, you know, you know, someone wrote a book, for example, and there's a lot of information in that book that I'd never heard before. And I was like, wow, where did this person
Where
get
did you get
access?
this?
Yeah, where did you get it? And when it came time to sit down and the rubber hit the road about where you actually got this, where are your sources? Because the book's not sourced at all. There's no source information. There's sort of
Mm.
no receipts, if you will. It's all,
And there's no public. This is something that's not through vetted through a publisher, because that would be a totally different story, right?
right. No, it was initially self-published, I think, and then maybe like a publisher that's
Mm.
sort of
Mm.
not. But in any case, people can just sort of say what they want, is what I'm trying to say. And if they don't, if they're not being sued or held for libel or slander or whatever, they'll put whatever out there. And
That's
I heard,
exactly what people do.
and
That's
100%.
exactly what these exploitative people do.
Hmm.
They just say what they want, and you can call them out on it, but are they going to care if they're getting something out of it? Whether they think that they're big stars in the true crime world, which I think is disgusting, but
Yeah, but they also think they're getting more attention if they're called out on it, right? So the best thing you can do is sort of, if you can, to ignore it. But what I would say to the listeners is, the folks that are consuming these stories, right,
Mhm.
is to be really critical and have, a critical mindset, right? Like, it's sort of a being able to have that ability to question what you're getting and what the information is that you're getting and where did it come from, so that it's just not automatically like, oh, well, I heard it on a podcast, right, or I saw it in a book, or I would, where did it come from? And that is what a good investigative reporter does.
Mhm.
They source their material, and they get more than one source, because just having one source is not, it either. You have to have it corroborated, and it's really important that folks do that. But yeah, the folks that are out there that put out information just for the sake of putting it out, or suggesting that they're right or whatever, they do really investigation.
There's something that happened pretty recently where somebody introduced something as being breaking news, and it was not.
Hmm.
And I saw other people pick it up. And it's not breaking news. It's always been known information, but somebody, for whatever reason, I can't understand and won't even, quite frankly, try to understand, release this as something like, everybody stop everything. This just in. It's not that at all.
Right.
It's downright harmful
Hmm.
when you know the story.
Hmm.
It's harmful and hurtful, and it's trash.
It is trash. It's just not good reporting. And that's the thing, is that consumers should know that. People that are listening to shows should know that. And people should call it out. They should call it out, frankly, when they see it or they hear it, to say, well, where did you get this information? Where did this come from? And I think with social media today, we're seeing that multiplied in so many ways, right? Like, that's just, so I think that what we're getting at here is that there is ethical reporting, right? There is ethical reporting about, these stories. And we're going to wrap up in a minute, but I just sort of wanted to see, and the ethics of it is important around, being victim informed, trauma informed, victim centered, thinking about families, talking with families. And that was a lot of what we were learning as well from Advocacy Con, hearing from families about what helps them. Because, on the one hand, families really do need the media to get their story out.
Oh yeah. And we need the support of law enforcement. So when
Exactly.
families say that they're upset about the way that the investigation has been handled, that is legitimate.
Mhm.
But we can't go online and scream at the top of our lungs about how everybody sucks as much as sometimes we want to. We can't, because then we don't get any help from the people who have the power to investigate these missing people, these murders. I can tell you with good authority, um, there is a case that I've been talking about for a long time. A woman named Charlene Roseman from Everett, Massachusetts, whose murder went unsolved for almost 16 years. Well, let's say it's 16 years unsolved. I have become friendly with her sister. And she told me the story about how when her sister disappeared, her family knew immediately that something was wrong. They went to their local police station. The local police said, she's 23. She's not missing. She'll come home. So for 6 days, her family was searching for her on their own. She was found. She had been murdered. And we just found out last week, and my whole body is tingling saying this. Her murderer was arrested after 16 years, and her family was beyond frustrated.
Yes. And let's just say alleged murderer because they haven't been tried yet.
Alleged murder, who I will not name. I do not need to name them. There were two players,
Hmm.
one of whom is deceased. Another player has been implicated, and the law. We're not the judge and jury here, so we're gonna let the case play out as it will,
Hmm.
and really hope for um, the resolution that for her family.
Yeah.
Um, but for 16 years, her family was like, I don't know what the police are doing. We haven't heard anything. We don't know. They have the family understood that Charlene knew the people who did this to her. Um, and it's going to be a long road between now and a trial.
Yeah.
But I'm very happy for her family that they have this.
Me too. And seeing that sort of the vigil that they had the other day was really powerful. And knowing that law enforcement does, keep these cases, on the burner and, they do work on them. I think we should do another show, Angel, about long-term cold
Hmm.
cases resolved. Let's do that.
Oh,
Let's
and
talk about that because that
there
is
are a lot of them.
especially with the unidentified, and that makes me excited. I post those on the our Facebook pages and our social media as well because I just love, again, because Andy's been missing for 40, almost 49 years. I love reading those stories where they're like, person identified or person recovered after 50 years. I'm like, yes, 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 it's possible. And to never give up hope. And I think that's really, really important. So for families and loved ones that are out there listening, we want to say, never give up hope. We're here. And I wanted to end I love this quote. And I thought maybe we could end with this. And, feel free to jump in. I'm not, sort of going to say when to stop, but the arc, and it's from Martin Luther King, but I remember it all the time because it really does get me through the day and get me through the years. And it's, his quote on the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
Hmm.
And I just have to believe that. I just have to believe that. And when we talk about relationships with law enforcement, it's another piece of the advocacy work that we're doing because it is essential,
Hmm.
essential to maintain those relationships, to maintain a good relationship, because otherwise, and believe me, I understand the frustration. I understand wanting to scream sometimes or jump up and down or out people or do any number of things, but the truth is they are the people in power, they are the people investigating, have limited resources. There's any number of things, and there are people that do a good job and there are people that don't do a good job, but it's really important to keep that relationship in both ways. Like the other thing we do, Angel, is we talk to law enforcement on our advocacy days. We have missing persons day at the state house, and we go to events with law enforcement agencies as well. And we talk a lot about family engagement, right? We talk to them about what the families need, even a phone call, even if it's to say, not a lot's happening on the case right now, but I want to let you know we haven't forgotten. We're still looking at it. I mean, that can be a treasure trove for
That's
families.
right. And where Charlene Roseman's case is concerned, and her sister Rose said it, here we thought that nothing was going on with her case, but they were working on it behind the scenes. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful that she was able to say that she got a phone call when she got a phone call from the Middlesex District Attorney's office here in Massachusetts when she was getting on a plane. So could you imagine how she felt during that flight to know that there was news about her sister who she misses so much? Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, that was so clear in the vigil the other day, the love that, is still there and that doesn't stop. And so that is really incredible. But yeah, I want to add it. And for folks, I'm Melanie McLaughlin, and, co podcast host and producer of Open Investigation. You can reach me at openinvestigation pod at gmail.com, among other ways, Google, all that good stuff, LinkedIn, there's link trees in our socials and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and would love to hear from you. Would love to hear what you guys think you'd like for the YouTube channel. This is a new YouTube channel that we're sharing and we're putting content on. There's going to be lots of content on here. We're going to get some great interviews. We'll have some original content. We'll have some edited content. We'll do some streams. We'll do some live streams
We'll do
once.
some live stuff, and maybe we'll hop back and forth. Maybe we'll do some on mine and here,
Yeah,
and share them
totally.
across, cross pollinate, all of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, whatever way we
It's
can. Yeah.
if for those of you who don't know us, and I can't anticipate that you know us right away, but we have this very common mission, Melanie and I. So we're happy to you know hear from you and hear about things that maybe we haven't spoken about that you might be interested in learning about. And I say it over and over again, I am here to learn. I am not just here to sit here and point my finger and tell everybody what they're doing wrong, because none of us wake up and do everything right every single day. So share with us things that maybe you've learned from this, or things that we can learn from you, because we really want that relationship with people who are interested in the subject matter.
Amen. And that are ethical about it. And that
Mhm,
same with me. I have a growth mindset. I'm always willing to learn, always willing to hear from folks. I heard from somebody, another incredible phone call I had yesterday. And,
mhm.
there's lots of folks out there that are doing really good work in this field, and we're happy to collaborate. And to the families and the survivors out there, we want to say, we're here. You're not alone. And I also want to say specifically to the survivors, um, and this is something I said in my podcast, and I think it's so important, is we believe you.
Mhm.
And, it's really important for folks to hear that. We believe you, and we're willing to do what we can to expose the injustice. So
That's right.
thanks, Angelle.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk soon. Very soon, I'm sure. We have lots of stuff that we're working on,
We'll
but
have all kinds of links and information in the YouTube.
definitely in the down below, learning all
Down
this
below.
stuff. So in the down below, not that down below, not that down below. Come on now. Um,
And I'll make sure I call hair and makeup for next
yeah, next
session.
time, right? And we'll figure out how to do a little bit of the filtering or whatever. But anyway, thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye.